Good evening and welcome to the very first installment of Democracy 30 here on SABC News. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. Really do appreciate it. This is a show where we will take a look into South Africa's democracy. And every week we will focus on different areas and ask the question, is this an aspiration realized or a dream deferred, as we try to make sense of the last 30 years of democracy. The road towards South Africa's democracy was a murky one, filled with pain and mistrust, as former enemies sat on the same table to agree and disagree on what the new country would and should look like. They agreed to build a non-racial, free, prosperous and democratic South Africa that respects human rights, dignity and equality. But 30 years on, we ask the question, are we on course or is this a dream deferred? Joining me this evening on my panel in studio is Mr. Snooky Zikalala, the president of the ANC Veterans League, Mr. Douglas Gibson, who is the former leader of the Democratic Party, and joining us over Zoom is anti-apartheid activist Dr. Ellen Busak. But first, let's take a look at this.
I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony.
A vision in which all South Africans would live as equals, free from oppression, marginalization and discrimination. The talks before the release of Nelson Mandela and subsequent CODESA and multi-party negotiations opened the road towards achieving that dream. It meant former enemies had to reach consensus about a country that could not only defeat and survive the legacy of apartheid, but transcend it and thrive. It fundamentally meant political power had to be shared. But the battle was felt on the streets. Disruptions, political assassinations influenced by the third force activities and township violence made life unbearable in the 90s. The bastions of apartheid determined to hold on to power, while the liberation movement pushed for majority rule. On 27 April 1994, a new era for the realization of that vision was ushered in. It would be a country rebuilt whose bricks would be cemented by the mortar of courage, confidence in the rule of law and respect for human rights. It would be a truly liberated nation, prospering not only from individual freedom, but freedom for all. 30 years later, is that vision on course? Nadia Dambuza, Democracy 30, SABC News.
We want you to be a part of this conversation, so please do send us your thoughts on X, and you can find us at SABC News as well as hashtag Democracy30. Remember to send us your voice note reactions as well as videos, 30 seconds long, to the number on your screen right now. Like I said, joining me in studio is Mr. Douglas Gibson, former member and former leader of the Democratic Party, Mr. Snooky Zikalala, who is the ANC Veterans League president, as well as Dr. Ellen Busak joining us over Zoom. Perhaps let's start with you, Mr. Zikalala. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Good evening to your viewers.
Let's go to the late 1980s, the early 1990s. The CODESA negotiations were taking place over there. The ANC and all the negotiating parties had to ask themselves, what is it that we're building and designing here? And I want you to take me there. What was being aspired for? What was being hoped for? What was being planned for at that point in time? What was the democracy that was being imagined?
Yeah, well, when negotiations were taking place, we looked at, wanted to build one unitary state with democratic values, with the rule of law, a state that was going to ensure that every language is being recognized by the government of the people. For instance, that time we had only two languages which were recognized. It was English, Afrikaans first, and English. All other languages were not officially recognized by the apartheid government. And also we look at the question of the Bill of Rights, which made sure that every individual in this country has got rights. There's free media in the country, that every individual has the right to vote for a person or a party of his choice. Every individual has a right to access medical care. Every individual has right to quality education. Every individual, irrespective of color, race, or creed, has right to live and work where he wants. And so those are the democratic values that we wanted to put in place. And of course, with us as the African National Congress, everything was based on the Freedom Charter, which is the charter, which is the Bible of the African National Congress, which was adopted in Cape Town. And so that's what we envisioned, and that's what we are implementing currently. And there is no any other party that had such values, such principles, such programs that we had. And of course, other parties came to the party as well. That is why we are saying we have a constitutional democracy, and we believe in the rule of law. And we believe that every citizen has a right to vote for a party of his choice.
Yeah.
And every citizen has a right to challenge government. There is no party that has been banned in this country by the ANC government. There's no individual who had a disagreement with the government of the ANC who has been taken to prison. There's no newspaper that has been banned in the country, and it will never happen. Our democracy will not allow that to happen.
Yeah. Mr. Gibson, what was being imagined? What was being hoped for?
Firstly, thank you very much for the promotion, but I was not the leader of the Democratic Party, or the DA. I was one of the leaders and chief whip of the opposition in Parliament for very many years, and subsequently an ambassador. I will remember 1994, my wife and I, Pam and I, sitting at the Union buildings, and how hopeful and how joyful I was at the new South Africa. And I remember the tears in my eyes when the helicopters flew up with the new South African flag. And it was a wonderful, wonderful day and experience, because I'd been in politics for forever before that. And what saddens me is that the answer to the question, have we achieved what we wanted to achieve, must be no.
Before we even get there, we sort of have to ask, and not to take away from the symbolism of it, what was being hoped for? What was being planned for? What was the strategy that went into the negotiating moment?
Look, I think the biggest achievement of that whole peace process, the negotiating at World Trade Center and subsequently in the Constitutional Assembly, and all of which I was privileged to have a front seat, or a back seat at least sometimes, was the fact that we managed to find each other as South Africans of different races, cultures, politics, religion, the whole lot. And we managed to find each other. Okay. And I think the biggest achievement of our whole 30 years was, in fact, negotiating a constitution which is holding. It's been the constitution of South Africa for 30 years. It's there to protect every individual and does that. And it's been amended on very few occasions. And I think that was the biggest achievement.
Yeah. Dr. Busak, did we find each other? Did the negotiating people at the table find each other? You know, they say a good negotiation is when two parties walk away from it both unhappy or both really happy. What was the mood walking away from that? Did the parties find each other and truly come to a realization that this is the country we want to build?
Well, thank you, Oliver. Good evening to your listeners and to my two colleagues there. Well, you know, I think of 1994, and I was part of CODESA 1, but was not allowed back into the team at CODESA 2. So I do not know what really happened. Unlike my colleague Gibson, I did not have a front seat or even a back seat at that thing. I came into 1994 after, 20-odd years in the struggle. I knew what we fought for. I understood clearly and directly what the young people gave up so much for, including their lives of so many. And I think that 1994 should have been the beginning of the fulfillment of their dreams. You talk about dreams being deferred. When I think of the last 30 years, or far too many dreams that have been destroyed, my only prayer is that that destruction was not total, was not totally complete and had not driven our people to such despair that we now have very little of a future left. And so I think I'm a bit conflicted about yesterday and about people saying about celebration. I think you commemorate the day, but I think there's very little to celebrate for the vast majority of our people, and that's where we are right now.
Yeah, we're going to talk about where the vast majority of South Africans truly are and the state and condition of their lives. But before we do that, let's go to just after 1994, Mr. Zikalala. Democracy is now here. There's a new government, government of national unity. What happens at that point in building the institutions, in building the cultures, in building the systems, and building the laws that are to be made thereafter that would later hold together our democracy? Did we do the foundational work correctly?
No, I think the foundational work was done correctly, especially during the reign of Nelson Mandela. And of course, when he left and handed over to Thabo Mbeki, the foundation was cemented. And I think we had a very, very solid foundation in itself, because we had to dismantle all the structures of apartheid. As you know, that all the 9 provinces we had Bantustan systems. We have to make sure that languages are equal. We have to make sure that we bring all the kids together. We have to unite the country itself. We have to make sure that we put in labor laws. Actually, I was one of those who was covering the South African labor laws as they were published, and of course adopted by Parliament, where workers had no rights in this country. Workers had no right to strike, no right to medical care, no right to office hours, and we put in those laws in place, where of course we started promoting women within government itself. As you can look, the government of South Africa is one of the most transformed government, where you find DDGs, all of them are intellectuals of South African color. All of them.
Can I pause you there, because I want to ask you the same question, but to take from what Mr. Zikalala says. Mr. Gibson, is the foundation holding together?
Up to a point. I think from 1994 until about 2008, at the end of the Mandela and Mbeki presidencies, we were doing pretty well. The growth rate was about 5%. We were building institutions, some of which managed to put up with the onslaught of state capture. I think President Zuma was a disaster for South Africa, and we've been going downhill ever since then. It has not improved. There's too many people who think we haven't achieved what we set out for, and too many people who think we're on our way to Zimbabwe. Now, I don't necessarily believe that. I'm an optimist. I always have been. And I'm hoping that South Africa will pull out of it. You know, one of the biggest problems is, we're told, is inequality. But I maintain that it's not inequality that's the problem. It's unemployment that's the problem. If people had, just several million more people had jobs, and our young people had a hope for the future, then equality comes naturally from those. And in order to do that, to get jobs, you have to have people who are properly educated and properly skilled. Now, one of the achievements has been that hundreds of thousands of people have been able to go to university that their parents never dreamt would be possible. Several million kids have been able to go to school and even get to matric. Their parents never never dreamt of being able to do that. But the problem is that the standard is quite often queried, and the degree choice. There are all sorts of people who've got wonderful degrees,
on the other side of the break,
but not the skills in order to do the jobs that are necessary.
On the other side of the break, I want us to look at some of the numbers that you're talking about to put into perspective the extent to which we've made progress, especially on educational outcomes and output. But before we go there, I do want us to take a break, and as we do, please send us your WhatsApp voice notes as well as your WhatsApp videos, 30 seconds long, to the number on your screen right now. And you can also find us on X at SABC News, as well as hashtag Democracy30. Don't go away. We'll be back on the other side of this. Well, Welcome back to Democracy 30. I'm in conversation with Mr. Douglas Gibson, former member of the Democratic Party, who participated in the peace talks and the Constitutional Assembly, discussing whether our country's democracy is on course or a dream deferred. I'm also in conversation with the president of the ANC Veterans League, that is Mr. Snooki Zikalala, as well as anti-apartheid activist Dr. Ellen Busak. Before we go back to the conversation, I want us to look at some of the numbers that define our democracy over the last 30 years. And we'll start with perhaps the most important indicator in a set of indices, and that is life expectancy. Let's take a look at that. Life expectancy in South Africa in 1994, when we just freshly got into democracy, was sitting at around 62.3%, well, 62.3 in terms of age, and that is an aggregate for both men and women at this stage, and that number is going to pop up on the graph just now as you take a look at it over there. And over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years, as we track that from 62.6, that went steeply down to where in 2004, life expectancy was at around 54 in terms of age. You would remember that's when the AIDS pandemic really hit South Africa the hardest. We overcame AIDS and life expectancy picked up once again, and in 2014 exceeded 1994 levels to 63.4 in terms of age, and life expectancy in South Africa today is 65 years old, which is comparable to the global average. Now, life expectancy is not just an indice in and of itself. It often is a measurement of the quality of healthcare, the quality of food, and the quality of access to basic services and resources people need to live, but to also live long. So South Africans, by that measurement, are living longer due to a myriad of interventions. If we take a look at other indicators about South Africa's progress between 1996 and 2019 at least, access to electricity in 1996 was sitting at around 58.2%. That means just about 6 in 10 South Africans had access to electricity. Today, more than 8 in 10 South Africans have access to electricity. Educational output paints a similar picture, where access to a national senior certificate in 1996 was at 15.6%. Today, that sits at 30%. The number of people that are in further education, whether it's an FET college or a university, in 1996 was only at 5.8%. Today, that is 15.4%, 3 times the number it was in 1996. Access to clean water was sitting at 60% of the population, just about, and today it's sitting at nearly 90% of the population. Access to sanitation sitting at 50.5% in 1996, and today that's sitting at 82.1%. And I want us to take a look at this last slide, because this reflects upon unemployment in South Africa and those numbers. And that's where the story is not so bright. There are more people unemployed today than there were in 1996. In fact, just about as around 1994, we had 2 million South Africans about unemployed, around. Today we have more than 7 million, almost 8 million South Africans unemployed. That means that there are 6 million more South Africans unemployed today than in 1996. That's not the exhaustive picture of what South Africa's democracy looked like. But I want you to reflect on it. Dr. Ellen Busak, I'll start with you. When you look at those indices about where we were at the start of our democracy versus where we are today, what are your reflections on it?
Well, a few things. Thank you for letting me back into the conversation. A few things that I want to say. But allow me to just go back for a moment to that foundation that you were talking about.
Sure.
I am of conviction that the foundation where we are today is a reflection of how faulty, how crackly that foundation was on which we were building. That foundation was not built on the will of the people. It was built upon the agreements that were made between the elites of the African National Congress and the elites of the old apartheid white capitalist establishment. Number 2, if you have a foundation that begins by saying we will have political power for black people, but economic power stays in the hands of white people, that's a wrong foundation. Inequalities is, unlike Mr. Gibson saying, it is at the heart on a problem, because social inequality is all by itself. An Oxfam report has explained to us, not disasters, not floods, not illness, not anything like that, but inequalities by itself causes the death of 4 people. No, hang on. For every 1 second, 4 people die. Now, so if you take that then I think the foundation was wrong. The numbers say things, and your numbers can be interpreted. But I wish we would stick to what the fundamentals are saying to us. And my argument is the fundamentals are wrong, and that's why we have a constitution that is cracked as well, and an Article 25 that will not be removed because of the land question. And so tonight is not, for me, a conversation about the numbers. It is a conversation about the fundamentals, and I hope that we could stick to that.
Mr. Zikalala, before we go to break, I do want you to reflect both on what Dr. Busak just had reflected on there, as well as some of the indices that we looked at here.
Yeah, well, I think the second slide that you showed, and which I have different indices here, shows that 92% of South Africans have safe water. 92% currently. I'm talking about now, yours are 2019. Secondly, is that 70% of our people live in the biggest country in cities. That is why the mortality rate is high compared to what it was. But the unemployment rate is true, it's high. Why is it high? Because we have COVID. During COVID, we lost 2 million jobs. And so the state itself now is reinventing the wheel, is making sure that more...
I mean, unemployment was a problem before COVID. COVID didn't create the unemployment in South Africa.
COVID exacerbated the issue of unemployment throughout the whole world. A lot of companies closed immediately when COVID was lifted 2 years ago. All the economy was in shambles. The economy is recovering now. More people are getting employed. Government is focusing on small businesses, making sure that small businesses create jobs, because the small businesses that are going to create jobs. And so what we are saying is that as African National Congress, we are going to make sure that we create unemployment for our people. I think inequality and unemployment are the biggest problem for the African National Congress. And
so let's perhaps pause there, right? Because Dr. Busak says at the heart of it is really inequality, and that's because we built upon a brittle foundation that is beginning to crack. What we know is that South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient, or one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, which is a measurement of inequality. It means in this country, the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. Where have we failed in our democratic project in solving inequality?
Well, I think I wouldn't say that we have failed. It's a question of saying that how did we develop skills of our people? How did we make sure that we empower especially the black people who are rising within the economy itself? How do we make sure that the Industrial Development Corporation, which is led by government, how do we make sure that the South African, especially the IDC itself, make sure that small businesses are given opportunities to create sustainable growth in the country? And so there was stagnation in the economy, as Douglas Gibson was saying. Since 2008, the economy plummeted, and because there was misrule in the country.
Okay, can I pause you there, because I do want us to come back and speak about some of the institutions you raised as part of the democratic project. Please do send us your reactions on the number on your screen right now. You can send us 30 minutes WhatsApp videos as well as WhatsApp voice notes, and send us your thoughts on X. It is at SABC News, as well as hashtag Democracy30. Don't go away. We'll be back on the other side of this. Welcome back to Democracy 30 here on SABC News. You've missed a heated conversation so far. If you're just tuning in, I'm in conversation with Mr. Douglas Gibson, as well as Dr. Ellen Busak, as well as the president of the ANC Veterans League, Snooki Zikalala. Before we went to the break, we reflected on some of the numbers and indices that had defined our democracy over the last couple of years. But I want to go to you, Mr. Gibson. How do we safeguard the progress that we've made?
Well, I think that it's very important to do that, but it's also important that we keep our eyes open. And Snooki, with great respect, lives in a different paradise to me. He thinks we should look at what skills we must give our people. Now, the ANC has been in power for 30 years. Surely they should know by now that we've got to raise the educational standard of our children at schools so that they don't end up being unemployable because their standard is so low, or because they haven't got the required skills, or because university students take the wrong degree choices. Instead of being channeled towards the things that South Africa needs to do the work that a modern economy requires. But then the problem is that we have our modern economy is being ruined by the ANC having fallen in love and worship as a religion, more or less, communist and socialist ideals, which have failed. And they still cling to the National Democratic Revolution. Instead of focusing on growth, on skills creation, on thereby reducing the inequality of our people.
Dr. Bosak,
if you just want to take what they've done to the economy, in 1994, the exchange rate of the dollar to the rand, or the rand to the dollar, was 3.61 to a US dollar. Today, one rand is worth 5 American cents. When Pam and I went to our first overseas holiday 50 years ago, the rand was worth more than the dollar.
Yeah.
That's what they've managed to do to our economy.
I do want to be very strict here on time, because we are thin on time. Dr. Bosak, I'll give you exactly 60 seconds here. You say we built this democracy on a brittle foundation. How do we change path?
Well, we've got to change path by stepping away from neoliberal capitalism that the ANC has embraced, which brought it so close not only to the old apartheid economic system, but to the DA's idea of economic systems. So we've got to move away from it. If the ANC had been more of a democratic socialist organization, we would not be in the mess that we are right now. So number two, we step away from this by breaking this bond between those who rule us and their love for money and corruption, which comes through their love for the system that they have built. And so for me, making sure that those who are ruling us now, and I include the DA in that, should not be in power. That's the first thing that we have to step away. And then we have to redesign and begin from the start, as we should have done in 1994.
Yeah, it's no secret who you will not be voting for on the 29th of May, but I'm going to have to leave it there, Dr. Bosak. Really appreciate it.
He sounds like a Zoom man.
Look, too much socialism, too little socialism, you decide. We continue the conversation on our social media platforms. Find us at SABC News. Find me at Oliver_speaking. #Democracy30. Thank you so much for tuning in to this inaugural episode. We're back with you next week, Sunday at 8:30. Thank you very much to my guests. It's good night for now. Cheers.